This time, the administration is moving faster to attack species in the public places that we love. They're being more aggressive and also more cavalier about what they're trying to do. There's this clear deregulatory emphasis, and that's permeating a lot of the discussion, a lot of the different actions we're seeing federally. And there's this trend in that deregulatory emphasis of cutting procedural corners and cutting the public out of the process.
I'm Meg Carney, an outdoor and environmental journalist, and this is the Outdoor Minimalist podcast. Thank you for joining us so that together we can create a better outdoor space as we recreate. In episode 190 of the Outdoor Minimalist podcast, we're discussing an urgent threat facing wildlife protections in the United States. More specifically, the ongoing dismantling of the Endangered Species Act under the Trump administration. The ESA has long been considered the backbone of wildlife conservation in this country and can be credited with saving iconic species like the bald eagle and the gray wolf. But legislative and administrative changes are actively eroding the very foundation of this landmark law and pushing for changes that could reshape how, or even if, we protect threatened and endangered species in the years to come. Joining me to break all of this down is Ramona McGee, Senior Attorney and Wildlife Program Leader at the Southern Environmental Law Center. Based in North Carolina, Ramona has been on the legal front lines for nearly a decade, defending the rich and often overlooked biodiversity of the American South. In this conversation, we'll explore what really is at stake if the legal definition of harm disappears from federal wildlife protections, how these changes could affect ecosystems and communities across the United States, and the industries poised to benefit from deregulation. So thank you so much for joining me on the Outdoor Minimalist podcast today, Ramona. This has been a question that I've been getting from listeners, so I'm really excited that you're here to really dissect and go over all of this information for all of us. And so let's just start by jumping right in and talking about what the Endangered Species Act actually is. So if listeners maybe aren't super familiar with what it is and what it covers, how it helps habitats and biodiversity, as well as why it would be such a cornerstone of environmental law in the United States.
It's such a great starting point. So the Endangered Species Act, or as some people call it, the ESA, is one of our nation's bedrock conservation laws. It provides a framework for protecting species from extinction. That's what it does at its heart. But the history behind it is remarkable because it's this history of hope, in my opinion. The Endangered Species Act was developed and passed by Congress more than 50 years ago now, back in 1973. And it was passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. I believe the Senate passed it unanimously. The House only had a handful of detractors, and then President Nixon signed it into law. So it's just this great example of how folks were united in the importance of this law. And it was passed with the explicit recognition of the many values of fish, wildlife, and plants, and how they were, and this is a quote, so I'm going to read this, how these species were being rendered extinct as a consequence of economic growth and development, untampered by adequate concern and conservation. And so the law was passed with this goal of protecting ecosystems through these species-specific protections. And in recognition of that, the law itself articulates its first purpose as, again, a quote, to provide a means whereby the ecosystems upon which endangered species and threatened species depend may be conserved. And I promise I'm not going to quote a bunch of law throughout this interview, but I just think those words are so powerful. Anytime I read them, I kind of get goosebumps all over again. And so the law, the Endangered Species Act, achieves these goals by putting this spotlight of protection on our most imperiled species. It sets out a process for determining whether a species is threatened or endangered, which are legal terms of art. And then once a species is declared as threatened or endangered under the Endangered Species Act, the law sets out certain protections that kick into place to ensure that those species don't go extinct.
Awesome. Yeah, I love that definition, and I didn't mind you reading the quotes. I think that that helps kind of set the context, especially that it has been something that's existed in law for such a long time, or it feels like a long time in our country's history. And you work specifically with the Southern Environmental Law Center and their wildlife program. So hence the name. A lot of that focus is in the American South, which happens to be one of the country's most biodiverse regions. So why do you think the South is so ecologically unique, and how does the Endangered Species Act kind of impact those areas the most?
Yeah, I love this question because I often think of myself as being an educator about our Southern biodiversity. I think a lot of folks, even here in the South, don't realize how incredible our species richness and variety is here. So to answer the question about like why we're so biodiverse, or to talk about our biodiversity, we have these amazing coastlines and beaches. We have the Appalachian Mountains over on the other side, and then everything in between. We have wetlands, we have forests, we have just this enormous variety of habitats, and with that comes an enormous variety of different animals and plants and fish. And there's a whole lot of history around that, about the climate, geography, and geologic history of the region that has led to this intense variety of species here. And I have a few kind of like fun facts about our Southern biodiversity that I love to share with folks. First off, the South is home to one of only 2 designated global biodiversity hotspots. The Atlantic coastal plain was designated one of these global biodiversity hotspots in 2016, and that includes that large swath of the coastal plain here in the Southeast. And then the South also has this remarkable amount of aquatic biodiversity, and that's why oftentimes in these different mapping exercises and analyses about biodiversity, you'll just see the South light up. It'll be all those darkest shades to show the most intense biodiversity. We have the richest aquatic fauna of any temperate area in the world, rivaling the tropics. We're home to 79% of all freshwater fishes in the United States and Canada. We also have an enormous number of mussels. We're home to around 91% of all of the nation's mussel species, and mussels keep our streams and rivers clean. So they play this important role, even though they might be easily overlooked by a lot of folks. And I'll give a quick shout out for Alabama, which is the most biodiverse state east of the Mississippi. I have so many fun facts, so I'll stop myself there, but just to make the point that like learn about this place, right? If you're not familiar with the South, come visit, learn about all the amazing wildlife we have here. And to answer the second part of your question, that's why attacks on the Endangered Species Act and other bedrock laws have such a huge impact here. There's just so much at stake here in the South when you're talking about species and wildlife.
Yeah, those were a lot of fun facts. I didn't know all of that about the mussels or how much aquatic life was there, which makes a lot of sense because of how much water is down there. And we have alluded to or mentioned that there are attacks on these types of like acts and laws that have been in place for decades. And one thing that we've been following pretty heavily, which I'm guessing most people listening have, is Trump's Big Beautiful Bill Act. So we're going to take a look at that first and see kind of like what it proposes when it comes to environmental protections, but particularly looking at the Endangered Species Act. So we looked a little bit at public lands last week on the podcast with the Big Beautiful Bill Act. And so now we can kind of transition to looking how it might impact wildlife with the Endangered Species Act. And if you are aware or do know anything about the Migratory Bird Treaty Act as well, I think that could be good to include.
Yeah, so as you've already been covering on the podcast, Meg, the bill, we'll call it HR 1, it's now a law, includes a lot of harmful provisions regarding public lands. And those provisions will open up public lands to different extractive uses like oil and gas leasing or mining or things like that. And those will have cascading impacts on species. And I want to pause and also celebrate the fact that it wasn't worse, right? We saw people galvanize against the possibility of a public land sell-off, and hopefully we'll have a chance to talk more about that later. But the final law did include those unfortunate provisions. But I'd say in terms of the Endangered Species Act implications, the main, most direct provision of the law is a rescission of unobligated funds for recovery actions for threatened and endangered species. And this was a $125 million pot of money under the Inflation Reduction Act. And now most of that money, we believe, has been spent, but not all of it. Several million dollars may still be out there that were unobligated that now will no longer be available to go towards developing recovery plans for threatened and endangered species, or taking those on the ground conservation actions necessary to recover those species. So that's the main part of HR 1. I'm not aware of Migratory Bird Treaty Act implications with that law in particular, although there have been other actions federally with the Migratory Bird Treaty Act implicated. So we can talk about that a little bit more later too. And I'll just, if I can for a moment, kind of pivot though a little bit. HR 1 was just the start. Really, there's no rest for the weary right now with this sort of work. Congress is already starting to work on its fiscal year 2026 budget process. And this week we were seeing reporting about and seeing the underlying language of the current House bill dealing with Fish and Wildlife Service and other agencies and the different amounts of funding that will be given to different activities there. And there's some highly problematic bits of language in that. I will say it is better than what the White House had proposed for the fiscal year 2026 budget, which was a whole lot of zeros. There were a lot of funds that were just completely eliminated under that budget proposal from the White House, including a really important program called the State Wildlife Grants Program. Thankfully, Congress is including that and some other funds still in the proposal, but the House budget still is a big slashing of the budget overall from last year's budget. So upshot is better than what the White House was proposing, still bad, still definitely worse than where we've been with species protections. This is just the start of the process. So this is an early draft of the bill. We'll see a lot of going back and forth. So listeners can be aware that you're going to be hearing a lot about this and different provisions coming and going as the final details get hashed out.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. It is definitely something that we should be watching, especially if we do care about the environment and animals, anything to do with biodiversity and climate change. And I guess if we can kind of pivot away from the budgets, from a legal standpoint, since that is your specialty, what would be... Yeah, that is the right question. Okay. What would be kind of different about how the current administration is approaching the Endangered Species Act compared to past administrations, including Trump's first term?
Yeah, that's a good question. Past administrations have generally honored the Endangered Species Act and the broad public support for this act and for wildlife. This administration is much bolder and hostile towards the Endangered Species Act and species protections. And I say it's much bolder. It's also much bolder than the first Trump administration. With the first Trump administration, species weren't on the chopping block until much later in the administration. This time, the administration is moving faster to attack species in the public places that we love. They're being more aggressive and also more cavalier about what they're trying to do. There's this clear deregulatory emphasis, and that's permeating a lot of the discussion, a lot of the different actions we're seeing federally. And there's this trend in that deregulatory emphasis of cutting procedural corners and cutting the public out of the process. And anytime we are taking the public out of public places, that's a red flag. So those are some of the big differences. I think another big difference, and this isn't strictly from a legal standpoint, but it's really important, is the way the administration has been slashing agency staff. So the enormous loss of Fish and Wildlife Service staff, Department of Interior staff, is going to have enormous effects on the ability of these agencies to fulfill their Endangered Species Act obligations and other environmental laws. I think some of the most recent reporting that we've seen had around 7,500 employees gone from Department of Interior, or roughly 11% of its staff. That's huge. And a lot of those staff are probably irreplaceable, folks who have been there for decades and who have this built up incredible knowledge of the species and the landscapes and even the way the government works that now won't be able to be just replaced. I mean, let alone the fact that in a lot of areas, it seems like they are not going to be hiring or backfilling for these positions.
Yeah, that loss of staff is absolutely devastating. And like you said, a lot of those, I mean, they would be able to be filled again in some capacity, but many of these people have deep knowledge of these remote ecosystems that like many other people might not, and they're not necessarily like entry-level positions all of the time.
Exactly.
Adventuring plans on your calendar? Remember to grab your Lava Linens travel towel on your way out the door. Founded by a mother-daughter team, Lava Linens crafts durable, luxurious travel towels as a more sustainable and better performing alternative to microfiber and cotton towels. Powered by flax, hemp, and tencel, they're designed to be by your side for years to come. Use the code Outdoor Minimalist for 15% off your next order. Let's kind of refocus on what exactly is going on then outside of these budgets and outside of the firings and like losing of staff. And one thing that you mentioned when we spoke before is something called the definition of harm. And so I want to talk a little bit about what that means within the definition of the Endangered Species Act and what exactly is going on with the administration in their redefining of how the Endangered Species Act exactly runs. I don't know if that's like a good way to frame this question, but in general, what is going on?
Yeah, no, happy to speak to that because it's a really big deal. So the starting point to back up a little bit is that the Endangered Species Act prohibits take of endangered species. And take is this technical legal term that's defined to include a host of possible actions, including to hunt, pursue, capture, harass, harm, kill. So all these different types of actions. And one of those I just said there is harm. And both the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service, which are the two agencies tasked with implementing the Endangered Species Act, they both have defined harm to include habitat change that kills or injures endangered or threatened species. So this idea that take basically through harm can include harming habitat. So that can be prohibited under the Endangered Species Act or protected against. And for more than 50 years, this is not just like some recent change in the law, but for more than 50 years, through 25 congressional terms and 10 presidential administrations, this prohibited take of species protected by the ESA has included significant habitat changes that result in species death or injury. Now, what the administration is proposing is to change that understanding of harm so as to narrow the scope of the Endangered Species Act to enable industries to bulldoze, mine, log, drill through sensitive ecosystems. They're trying to narrow it to exclude habitat protections. Does that help explain what's happening a bit?
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, what would their motivation for that be? Is it to allow extractive industry, to allow the sale of lands? What is kind of their goal with rolling this back or changing the definitions?
It's a good question, and it's hard to say exactly what the intent is behind it, but it certainly seems like the intent is to exclude habitat destruction, which then will frankly just narrow the scope of the act to where a habitat destroying activity no longer has to go through the processes of the Endangered Species Act. So right now, you can't just go out and chop down a tree that is being used by a threatened or endangered species. You either have to either you don't do it, or you have to go through the correct processes to get a permit to ensure that you're avoiding and minimizing the harm. So as to ensure, if you're a federal agency, that you're not likely to jeopardize the continued existence of that species. So there's this whole process before you can chop down that tree. Now, if this goes forward, it seems to be the intent to just remove that completely from being covered under the Endangered Species Act, so that people could go out and take these harmful actions to habitat that will harm not just threatened and endangered species, but species that we think of as common that also benefit from those habitat protections.
So procedurally, I guess, how would they go about doing this? How would it be possible to change something that has been in existence for so long within the legal system?
Yeah, so there's a process for that, and it's a regulatory rulemaking process. So this has been proposed as a rescission of this definition of harm. That is the process, is this agency process where the public can comment, and the public did comment overwhelmingly against this proposal, raising a lot of concerns. And the next step in the process is for the agencies to issue a final rule. And the final rule could do a few things. It will most likely just finalize what they proposed and remove the definition of harm. As indicated, along with that, there's this intent to narrow and limit the scope of the Endangered Species Act. So that's how that'll go forward. Did that make sense, or should I try that again?
I think that made sense. That made sense to me. So this reframing or like removal of the definition of harm within the Endangered Species Act, is that coming from executive orders or secretarial orders, or what other orders have been evolving that would also implicate these endangered species?
Yeah, so no, this definition of harm is a solely regulatory action. So it's something that the agencies have formally proposed. I say formally proposed, but they've done that in 4 ways, like not compliant ways. So I don't want to overstate like that they have adhered to the regulatory process. We have concerns with how they're doing this. But to the point about executive orders and secretarial orders, astute listeners have probably heard about some of these. The media certainly have been covering the different executive orders that come out. And I want to kind of start out by saying these are more statements of intent, right? Executive orders set policy or a statement of intent that then influence or inform later agency actions. Most often, the executive order in and of itself doesn't really do much. You kind of have to wait and see how the agency is going to implement it. Now, that said, the Endangered Species Act and species have certainly been the subject of many different executive orders and some Department of Interior secretarial orders. They really go at, again, that deregulatory agenda that we were talking about earlier, where some of the executive orders and secretarial orders are really pushing for these truncated or rushed environmental reviews. There was an early executive order about energy projects that included a roadmap of the different regulations the administration seemed to be targeting for review and possible changes, including Endangered Species Act and Migratory Bird Treaty Act regulations. There was an executive order setting this 10-to-1 goal of, for every new rule an agency proposes, it must also eliminate 10 rules, which if you start doing that, you're going to start chipping away at important regulations. It also means there's a pretty big thumb on the scale against new regulations. And under the Endangered Species Act, every species is listed by regulation. So the way that you get a species on the list to then be protected is through regulation. So if we're disincentivizing listings, we're disincentivizing ESA protections being extended to new species or newly listed species. There's a lot more in the executive order and secretarial order bucket. Again, kind of with this general theme of trying to push through or limit environmental review and public process around different actions.
Yeah, we definitely don't have to go into the details of all of them, but I appreciate
we don't have time.
No, that's too many. I appreciate that review and kind of like how it kind of fits into the order of things, because I think the news of executive orders can often be kind of overwhelming. So understanding kind of like, oh, this is not actually law yet. It's just the intent and what they would like to see. But you did once again mention the Migratory Birds Treaty Act. So I do want to touch on that a little bit more in detail before we move on, and what might be changing with that and what exactly it is and how it compares to the ESA, or if they work together.
Oh, that's such a great question. So to take the second part of your question, they do work together, but they are also distinct. So they work together because oftentimes a project might be considering multiple laws at once as it's figuring out how to go forward and modify a project to adhere to different laws. The Fish and Wildlife Service also administers both the Endangered Species Act and the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So there is some overlap. But the Migratory Bird Treaty Act includes a whole swath of species that are not protected under the Endangered Species Act. So lots of common birds, a lot of common bird species are covered under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act that otherwise are not going to be protected under the Endangered Species Act. And the Migratory Bird Treaty Act has this great sort of kind of cooperative feel to it, I think, where there are these protections that are set in place that to ensure that industries don't harm migratory birds. And so industries have developed all sorts of different best practices to ensure that they are reducing the risk to migratory birds. All that said, during the first Trump administration, the MBTA, Migratory Bird Treaty Act, was targeted. And in particular, the Trump administration rolled back and narrowed the scope of the Act's protections so that incidental take would not be protected against. So the idea is narrowing it to only prohibit take that was direct and intentional of a species. So if you're power washing a bridge and the goal is to power wash the bridge and you happen to knock off a nest, that's less likely to be protected if you don't protect incidental take. And so that happened under the first Trump administration. And already under this administration, we are seeing attempts to go back towards that understanding of, again, limiting the scope of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. There have been in more kind of internal sort of decisions. There was a secretarial opinion that reverted back to a Trump 1 understanding of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. This is super wonky stuff, but the upshot is that, yes, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act is being targeted or being altered in important ways. And we'll see whether or not the Trump administration, again, proposes to make changes more in the regulatory space as well.
It's just wild to me that they are going after things like this. Okay, so with all of that in mind, I feel like we're coming at this from a lot of different angles, or there are a lot of different levels of attack, I guess, that are kind of going on. It can be hard to follow, so I appreciate you breaking that down. But are there particular species in the South, habitats, wildlife refuges, anything like that, that you think would face imminent risk with any of these administration changes or legal changes within the ESA?
It's a great question, and I'd say right now, I am worried about all manner of species, from eastern hellbenders to migratory birds to mussels, um, as well as species that we think of as common that we kind of take for granted as being all right. We're likely to see declines in all of those species if these rollbacks go forward. So I'm concerned about it in terms of like imminence. I think one of the most imminent and worrisome risks is that enormous loss of staff. That's where we're going to see a lot of the harmful on the ground effects, because wildlife refuges no longer have staff to go out and manage the refuge and manage the resource. And to be clear, wildlife refuges were already severely understaffed before this whole onslaught on Fish and Wildlife Service staff started. But now we're hearing about, one refuge manager having to take care of multiple refuges that are across, hundreds of miles of land. It's not feasible. No one can be expected to do all of the things that need to be done. So that's, when I think of imminence, that's where I go to, is the loss of staff and inability to fulfill those duties. But then more broadly, in terms of like species and habitats, I think it's a lot of all of the above.
So sad. Okay. It's hard to talk about these topics sometimes, where it's like, oh, this is really bad. So to close,
can I say something on that?
Yes.
I totally agree. And I want to be clear that like none of that, a lot of this has not happened yet, right? And it is not irreversible. And maybe that's where you were going to take us. But I was so glad you asked about the executive orders because of that, because sometimes I hear from folks like this happened as if the executive order did the thing, and trying to clarify that no, there are still a whole lot of steps that have to happen before that actually takes effect. So even as we're saying, like, I'm worried about these things, I'm worried about it, but I also have a lot of hope. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's absolutely where I wanted to go. So I'm glad that you took us there. Because you do work in like the legal and advocacy space with the environment, I think that you're well positioned to like counter and understand what these rollbacks mean and the implications of them all. So what strategies has the Law Center kind of been using to address these types of issues?
Yeah, so the Southern Environmental Law Center, or SELC, and the broader conservation community is really taking an all of the above, all hands on deck sort of approach here, right? That includes a lot of communications and education and outreach. We want to be helping with mobilizing diverse stakeholders, filing lawsuits. Absolutely. That's kind of in our name. So we certainly do that. Shining light on the worrisome practices and projects through media work, working in the regulatory spaces. So we've been talking about regulations and rules, and that gets really technical, but that involves a whole lot of monitoring agency actions, requesting public records, working with experts in the field and scientists to understand what all this means, and then representing that in these robust comments and making sure that the public's voices are heard alongside all of that. So it's everything, right? We're doing all of that. And as I'm saying I'm not just meaning SELC, I'm meaning the broader conservation community. And I'll just note again the impressive outreach and public outcry regarding public lands recently. Like, that has been inspiring, and also is the sort of work that all of us in the conservation community are going to need to keep doing.
Yeah, would you say that collective action and that collaboration that we're kind of seeing across the conservation community and also the outdoor community has kind of helped you keep going, or what exactly is kind of giving you hope in this space? Because you said you had some.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely. So so that's one part of it. I think for me, like the hope really boils down to two things, to people power and then to nature's resilience. On the people power point, I'm heartened by seeing people mobilize and all these diverse stakeholders working together. We at SELC have a vast partner network, somewhere around 200 or more different partner organizations that we're working with. And I note that to say they inspire me. Like we have these incredible advocates, these brilliant people, these brave people who are coming out and standing up for public lands, for wildlife, for clean air, clean water, like the whole array. And that gives me a lot of hope to see that here in the South and then across the nation, to see all the people working together and standing up for our environment. And then I mentioned nature, and I know it may be a little hokey, but I do take a lot of heart from knowing that nature and species in particular can recover. The Endangered Species Act has been remarkably successful at its goal of preventing extinction. Roughly 99% of listed species have not gone extinct. Roughly 99% of species listed under the Endangered Species Act have not gone extinct. That's an incredible success rate. And we've also had fantastic success stories under the Endangered Species Act, like with the bald eagle, with the brown pelican, the American alligator. And that's even despite the constantly dwindling funding for the Endangered Species Act throughout the years. So that knowledge that like species can and do recover gives me a lot of hope. To give a really specific example, our team in South Carolina has spent years of advocacy on behalf of red knots and horseshoe crabs. So horseshoe crabs are incredible in and of themselves. If you're not familiar, Google them. They're really, really neat animals, prehistoric in nature. And they breed on a lot of southeastern beaches. And in South Carolina, the federally threatened red knot has timed its migration perfectly to coincide with when horseshoe crabs are breeding on those South Carolina beaches, so that they can eat those eggs, which will fuel their transpolar migration. The problem has been there have been harvesting efforts by the biomedical industry over the past several years that was disrupting that balance. And our team in South Carolina had a lot of success through litigation and otherwise to ensure that beaches would again be closed to that harmful horseshoe crab harvesting practice. And now we're starting to see the results of that. We're seeing the benefits of that, of seeing these videos and pictures of these beaches that are now just teeming with life, with the red knots just scurrying about and the horseshoe crabs all on the beach as they should be. So it's those sorts of stories that give me a lot of hope.
Yeah, I love that. I love hearing success stories for endangered species like that, where people's efforts and nature's efforts have gone a long way. And although we have focused a lot on the southeastern United States, right, this implicates wildlife areas and wildlife across the country. And so no matter where a listener may be located in the United States, what do you think is the best way to kind of stay informed about some of the changes that are going on with the ESA and to get more involved with efforts to help conserve these areas?
I love that question. Well, if you are in the South, then I will put in a shameless plug to follow SELC. But if you're not in the South, there are lots of other wonderful organizations, nationally, regionally, and state-based organizations focused on wildlife. So I would encourage listeners to learn about the organizations working in their area. I'd say especially some of the more local ones, and to get involved, right? Get involved, go volunteer, go learn about pollinators, do those sorts of activities where you not only can learn how you can make a difference in your backyard, literally or figuratively, but also meet the other people who care about these issues and start talking with them. I'd say also learn about and maybe reach out to your state wildlife agencies. A lot of state wildlife agencies right now are actually updating their state wildlife action plans and seeking public comment. So you could look into that and get involved. You can be reaching out to the Federal Fish and Wildlife Service and learning more about what they do, or seeing if there's a way to get involved with the wildlife refuge down the road. So there's a whole lot of opportunities, and I think getting connected and getting educated is important. But then I also think it's really important that lawmakers hear about how people care about wildlife, right? So I think it's really important to reach out to decision makers and to make sure that those decision makers are hearing from real people with real interests in wildlife and habitat. To put it like kind of bluntly, and again, maybe this is a little hokey, but those species, the fish and birds and other animals that you appreciate, can't vote. So it's incumbent upon us to speak up on behalf of them and make sure that we are representing the interests of the wildlife and the public places that we care so much about.
Absolutely. I love that, even if it is hokey. Okay. So if people do want to learn more about SELC's efforts to protect Southern biodiversity, what is the best way to get in contact or to access your resources?
Yes. So we have a website. It is selc.org. So that's SELC as in Southern Environmental Law Center.org. You should definitely check it out. We have a lot of resources on our website, a lot of information about all the different work we do. We do so much more than just biodiversity and public lands work. We have clean water, clean air, clean energy, environmental justice work. We really do run the gamut when it comes to the environmental issues we're tackling. And then we're also on most social media platforms. So I would check out SELC on Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, wherever you might be. We do also have a podcast. It's called Broken Ground, and it'll dive in deep on a different topic each season. So it's not as regular as your podcast here. So folks should absolutely keep listening to Meg, and also just supplement it occasionally with Broken Ground.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, I love podcasts, obviously. So I'll have to make sure I check that out. And as always, I'll include the links to all of that in the show notes so it's easy to find. But with that, Ramona, thank you so much for breaking down these complex topics. It definitely helped me understand it a little bit more, and I hope it helped the listeners as well.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening. And if you like what you hear, let me know. Leave a review and be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can find us on Instagram at outdoor.minimalist.book, on YouTube, or subscribe to our weekly newsletter at theoutdoorminimalist.com. For even more updates, other educational resources, and to help build an outdoor community with the shared goal to create a better outdoor space as we recreate.